Okay, so I think it's time to start our speaker series since it's about like almost 10 minutes late. Okay, so before we start, I would like to invite as Assistant Professor Dr. Thitirat Panbamrungkit, Head of Department of Geography, Chulalongkorn University, to open the session and give a brief background of our speaker series.
Thank you, Ajahn Phetpilai. And good evening, Professor Matthew and everyone. I'm Thitirat Panbamrungkit from Department of Geography, Chulalongkorn University. On behalf of our organizing committees, I would like to welcome you all to the 8th Virtual Geography Speaker Series. This speaker series aims to exchange knowledge and expand the horizon of geographical research in Thailand. This series was co-organized by the Department of Geography from the University of Wisconsin-Medicine, Chiang Mai University, Naleswan University, Chulalongkorn University, and the Geographical Association of Thailand. This virtual geography seminar will be held continuously once a month, and today is the 8th seminar. Before we start, let me introduce Dr. Phetpilai Latnan. She will be our moderator today for this session. Dr. Phetpilai is a lecturer in the Department of Geography, Faculty of Art, Chulalongkorn University. She has been working at the department since 2017. Her research interest is is about urban study, smart city, urban development and planning, particularly in Southeast Asia. Okay, I think I would like to give your on the stage now, Dr. Phetpilai. Please enjoy our seminar today. Thank you. Oh, please unmute, Dr. Phetpilai.
I forgot. Thank you very much. Thank you very much again, Dr. Thitirat. As a moderator, I would like to introduce our speaker, Professor Matthew Gandy. It's an honor to have Professor Matthew with us today. He is a professor of cultural and historical geography at the Department of Geography, University of Cambridge. He's also a fellow of King's College. From 2013 to 2018, Matthew was co-editor of the International Journal of Urban Regional Research. Matthew's research interest is mainly focused on urban studies. I would like to give a few research themes that he's focusing on, which is urban metabolism, critical landscape studies, urban political ecologies, and cinematic landscapes and documentary filmmaking. Matthew has plenty of publication, both articles and books. His latest publication explores urban nature in an international context, and it is the topic that he's going to share with us today. Matthew will give a talk around 45 to 50 minutes, followed by 20 to 30 minutes Q&A session. If you have any question during the talk, you can type it in the chat. Otherwise, you can keep your question to ask him directly during the Q&A session. So although this seminar is running in English, please feel free to ask question in Thai. Our team and I will try to translate it for you. And now I'm going to give the stage to Professor Matthew. Please welcome Professor Matthew Gandy.
Thank you. I'm just going to try and share my screen.
Okay.
Okay, is that working for everybody?
Yes. Yes.
Yep. Great. Okay. Well, thanks so much for the invitation. And I think it's great building these international connections in relation to geographical knowledge and research. And what I'm going to do today is to talk about some of the themes in my new book, Natura Urbana, Ecological Constellations in Urban Space. And the main theme of this book is urban nature, which seems to be a topic that's grown in terms of the amount of discussion and interest, partly perhaps through the COVID-19 pandemic, many people becoming much more aware of nature around them on their doorstep, so to speak. And in terms of my own interests in urban nature as a topic, I was reflecting really when this book came out just recently that it's almost exactly 20 years after my book Concrete and Clay, Reworking Nature in New York City. And that 20-year period has seen a number of very important and dramatic changes in terms of global environmental change. Of course, questions of biodiversity loss, climate change, and so on have become much more pressing in that 20-year period. Equally, academic work on urban nature and urban environmental themes has really exploded. It's a huge literature. And one of the challenges I faced in writing this book, which is really an overview of the whole question of urban nature, one of the real challenges I faced was how to make sense of this vast and dynamic literature. And in terms of thinking about how to conceptualize urban nature, there's also an important difference between some of my earlier work in relation to New York City and my current interests in urban biodiversity, that in the earlier work, I focused on what we could call metropolitan natures, that is, designed or produced natures, such as parks, gardens, infrastructure systems, and so on. And in my most recent work and the work for this book, I've been particularly interested in spontaneous spaces of nature, non-designed or unexpected or overlooked dimensions of nature. So there's been a shift of emphasis in certain ways in the way that I'm looking at the question of urban nature. And in order to make sense of this very dynamic and complex field, I suggest in my book that there are 4 main approaches to urban ecology, which provide us with a kind of working typology. And possibly you may have a different view about what's the most useful typology to adopt, but I'm going to, in the rest of my presentation, I'm going to outline how I've developed this 4-fold typology, and we can perhaps discuss whether that's useful in order to reflect on the theme of urban nature. Now, the four aspects to this typology that I want to talk about today are, firstly, the systems-based approach. And I'm going to emphasize that this is the dominant approach in terms of conceptualizing urban ecology and urban nature. It's the dominant approach in most universities, in professional practice, in the realm of urban and environmental policy making, with strong links to things like resilience discourse, urban sustainability, ecosystem services, these terms that have now become increasingly international in terms of their circulation. The second approach that I want to discuss is that of observational paradigms. And by that, I mean the direct observation of urban nature itself developing particularly from the 19th century onwards in terms of the emergence of fields of urban botany and urban ornithology, and the fascination with, if you like, actually existing manifestations of nature in urban and also to some degree industrial spaces. And this fascination with direct observation, I will suggest, spills over from the scientific domain into the visual arts and cultural discourses as well. So it's quite a diverse strand, and it's very much still present. And then a third strand, that of urban political ecology, which is a kind of radical analytical perspective, which is something that is quite close to the kind of work that I've been doing for a number of years. And I'll outline what I mean by the idea of urban political ecology, and perhaps just very briefly highlight some of the contemporary changes in that field. And then finally, what I refer to as the ecological pluriverse, as in a way the most recent conceptual framing for urban nature, places particular emphasis on the sharing of space with non-human others, the multi-species city, if you like, which has begun to influence aspects of architecture, landscape design, and other fields. So to start then, I want to outline this first element here, the systems-based approaches. Now, if we try to get a sense of the history of systems-based approaches, one useful starting point is the so-called Chicago School of Urban Sociology, which used a variety of scientific metaphors in the 1920s and 1930s, such as metaphors such as plant succession, to study processes of neighborhood change. But although the Chicago School of Urban Sociology made use of these scientific and ecological metaphors, it wasn't really about ecology as such, although it proved highly influential in terms of the wider field of urban sociology and urban studies. And to really get a sense of the systems-based approach being more systematically applied, we have to look slightly later, for example, to the so-called Brussels School of Urban Ecology, developed by the botanist Paul Duvigneau in particular. Duvigneau was a tropical ecologist who then started to apply his insights to the study of urban ecosystems and metropolitan space. And his particular interests were to do with metabolic conceptions of urban space, the flow of energy and materials through cities and urban space. And in a sense, he tried to present a kind of diagrammatic representation of the city that was analytically based on the kind of work he'd been doing on tropical rainforests. So it was a very direct attempt to apply ecological and scientific knowledge to understanding how urban space functioned. These kind of functional or metabolic approaches are also seen in the 1980s and 1990s in terms of the so-called industrial metabolism school of Fischer-Kowalski, for example, and also in North America, a number of influential approaches to urban ecology really build on these systems-based approaches in a variety of ways. So the so-called Baltimore School of Urban Ecology, also very much based on the measurement of energy flows, the use of materials within urban space. The Baltimore School explicitly present themselves as the successor to the Chicago School in the 1920s and the 1930s. And as I mentioned in the introduction, the systems-based approach is now really the dominant ecological paradigm across resilience discourse, landscape urbanism, and many other applied fields. It's what, for the most part, it's what students are learning and discussing in relation to urban ecology and urban nature. And one characteristic feature of the systems-based approach is an emphasis on epistemological unity between the biophysical and social sciences. In other words, a particular conception of interdisciplinarity, which essentially assumes that all disciplines can be linked together to form part of this systems-based paradigm. And that might be something we want to reflect on or discuss, whether such a kind of forced unity is desirable or possible in this field of research. Now, the next vantage point that I want to talk about is that of observational paradigms. And I suggested that this really comes to prominence, particularly in the 19th century. And I am drawing particularly on examples from Europe and North America in terms of making this particular point. So in the 19th century then, we find a growing fascination with ruins and waste spaces and the unusual plants to be found. And just to give a couple of illustrations of this emergence of an observational paradigm, on the left here we see this image from Richard Deakin's Flora of the Colosseum in Rome, published in 1855. And at this time in the mid-19th century, this archaeological site was in a state of neglect. But from an ecological perspective, it was a source of complete fascination. So the botanist Richard Deakin found over 400 different species of plants growing in the ruins of the Roman Colosseum, including species which had originated far away in North Africa and elsewhere, and had formed part of this extremely interesting kind of global ecology in the ruins of the Colosseum, where traces of global history were directly reflected in this unusual assortment of plants. I should, as a kind of footnote, I should say that in the 1870s, when the modern Italian state was unified, part of the modernization program involved cleaning up ruins and so on, and a lot of these interesting ecologies were swept aside. So it's very much a historically unspecific example. Other examples in the 19th century that attracted the attention of botanists were so-called ballast floras in ports. And these are the unusual collections of plants associated with the waste disposed of by international ships in harbors and port areas. So we have these unusual plants connected to global shipping routes and global trade that botanists became very interested in. We also find in the 19th century some systematic botanical surveys of industrial floras in Germany, Luxembourg, Switzerland, and elsewhere. And it's very interesting reading these old reports to get a sense of what these botanists were really excited about, what they were interested in. Another important strand in terms of this focus on unusual urban ecologies is the effects of war and aerial bombardment and the production of so-called bomb sites. So what you see in the illustration on the right is the product of aerial bombardment, one of these empty spaces or bomb sites in London, being examined by botanists in the early 1940s, who recognized that there were very interesting plants springing up in these stony rubble spaces in the middle of cities. And this focus then on unusual ecologies in cities actually had important political implications as we go through the 1960s and 1970s, because previously the study of what's called plant sociology and landscapes had been really preoccupied with so-called nativist conceptions of ecology and landscape. And with these new urban ecologies, these previous categories were disturbed with new combinations of plants and so on. So these distinctions, if you like, between native and non-native, which have been quite influential within botany and ecology, were really unsettled by the emergence of these new and unusual urban ecologies. And as this body of work has developed, there's been particular interest in how organisms have adapted to urban space, how introductions have shaped urban ecologies. One interesting example from Berlin, I should say that the island city of West Berlin was in many ways the focal point for post-war urban ecology, with this very intense focus on these waste spaces produced by war, and then at a later stage by geopolitical division and other processes. So an intense study on these empty spaces and how they changed over time with these new ecological assemblages. So in the image on the left here, you see an unusual plant, a fragrant weed, Dysphaenia botrytis, originally from the Mediterranean, that flourished in these hot, stony environments in cities such as Berlin. And this fascination then with unusual urban ecologies led to very intense cartographic mapping projects in Berlin, in West Berlin, where, as you can see on the right, they tried to divide up the whole city into these novel or distinctive biotopes, this biotope mapping program, which produced very interesting knowledge about urban nature. And it was detailed enough and scientifically convincing enough to actually play a role in land use planning. So we had some examples of nature reserves which emerged from the protection of unusual urban biotopes. And more recently, we see examples of novel ecosystems and new species in urban ecologies that have attracted a lot of attention. So in London and some other European cities, the rose-ringed parakeet, originally from South Asia, has become a familiar part of the urban fauna of the city. These brightly coloured green birds with their distinctive call is now part of the ecology of the city, and has provoked very interesting debate about the nature of contemporary urban ecologies. Los Angeles similarly has a number of new parrots and parakeets flourishing within the metropolitan area. And sometimes ecologists refer to these recombinant ecologies as a new way to conceptualize ecological relations. And this notion of the observational paradigm, though, places particular emphasis on the close contact between people and urban nature. So noticing nature, maybe taking notes, photographs, exchanging information. So this very close, multi-sensory, in some ways, contact with nature. I mentioned at the start of my presentation how the COVID-19 pandemic had made people very much aware of nature on their doorstep. And the sound of birdsong, for example, during the COVID lockdowns was very widely discussed and remarked on. So these different manifestations. Also, I would say that these observational approaches could be linked to aspects of citizen science and enabling a scientifically enriched public realm to develop, enabling the opportunity for ordinary people to make observations or collect data and contribute to forms of environmental understanding. And I just have an example for you here. I do a lot of work in Berlin in Germany, and there's a mapping project in Berlin and the regional state of Brandenburg, a mapping project for butterflies and moths. If I see something interesting, I'll send in a record to this cartographic project. So it gives me great satisfaction to see that I have a blob on this map, which is connected to my observation that I've sent into the project. And of course, hundreds of other people also to contribute to these kind of projects to collect data. So data in relation to endangered species, data in connection with to species that help us to understand environmental change, climate change, for example, affecting the distribution of species. And here the public can collect really useful data. Also, another aspect is tree health. In the UK, many trees are suffering from diseases for various reasons, but the public can monitor tree health and make their own observations, which can be very useful and important. So citizen science then being one of the contemporary dimensions to this observational paradigm. The third approach, this of urban political ecology, as I mentioned, this is an approach which my own work has been quite closely associated with for a while, and some of the, if you like, the pioneers within urban political ecology, such as Eric Swingerdow, have been a major influence on my own work and thinking for a long time. Now, in terms of making sense of what urban political ecology is, I think a very useful benchmark is the edited collection here from 2006 in the Nature of Cities, which really draws together a kind of snapshot of urban political ecology, or what's actually been widely referred to as the first wave of urban political ecology, because authors suggest there have been subsequently second and even third waves of urban political ecology. But as a starting point then, the first wave of urban political ecology has at least 6 intellectual strands to it. A first strand is how the original field of political ecology, developing especially in the global south in relation to the politics of environmental degradation. For example, Michael Watt's work on Nigeria then became expanded into looking at processes of environmental degradation in urban spaces and also in the global north. So one important strand then is this expansion of a radical political ecology perspective to a wider set of topics. Secondly, I would say that urban political ecology was also influenced by important strands in urban and environmental history, and particularly studies of public health and housing conditions. in industrial cities. Engels' work on Manchester in the 19th century, for example, and other classic studies of urban living conditions is also another element within the emergence of urban political ecology. A third strand has been particularly associated with the so-called Frankfurt School inspired critique of science and technology. So this is a kind of an important strand. A fourth strand is that of anti-essentialist conceptions of nature, breaking down these nature-culture dualisms. And scholars such as Donna Haraway were certainly influential in the emergence of this urban political ecology paradigm. A fifth strand here we could perhaps emphasize as neo-Marxian interpretations of urban metabolism. So very different. I mentioned earlier the Duvigneau study of Brussels with the flow of energy and materials as a conceptualization of urban space. The neo-Marxian interpretation of urban metabolism, very different in terms of an emphasis on the circulatory dynamics of capital and its relationship to the circulatory dynamics of urban space, and particularly the flow of water and urban infrastructure systems, so a different kind of emphasis. And then perhaps the sixth strand here in relation to urban political ecology is that of the rise of grassroots urban environmental protest in the late 60s and early 70s. This image here from Puerto Rican activism in the late 60s, which I looked at in my research I did on New York City, but directly confronting questions of racism, public health crises, inadequate housing, inadequate sanitation and so on in urban areas. So also a shift perhaps in the conceptualization of what nature is. So not, if you like, a focus on wilderness areas or nature that is somewhere out there, but nature that is right here in terms of the human environment as the scope of what we understand nature to be. And this field of urban political ecology then remains an important focal point for a very large range of work on urban nature and urban environmental processes. But there are, however, some very interesting tensions or challenges facing urban political ecology, which I just want to briefly highlight. One challenge is that although urban political ecology has the word ecology in its conceptual framework, for various reasons, there hasn't been that much direct interaction between urban political ecology and scientific advances within ecology itself, and arguably other scientific fields such as toxicology and so on, which would be directly relevant to this approach. So the interface with science, you could argue, needs further development. Another possible point of weakness in urban political ecology is, to some degree, its uncertainty in handling the decentering of the human subject, which is something that's been debated in cultural geography, anthropology, the environmental humanities, and so on, looking beyond the bounded human subject to more complex understandings of agency, including, for example, affective atmospheres, and links to multi-sensory geographies and so on. So questions then around agency have perhaps been neglected within urban political ecology. A further element of tension and debate has revolved around the definition of the city and the relationship between cities and urbanization. So a very interesting set of debates about the appropriate scale or empirical focus of urban political ecology research. So this is possibly a theme that we could return to in the discussion, the sense of what we understand the city to be and its relationship to regional or global processes of urbanization and how we should understand or study these. And another strand, an underexplored strand, we could say, within urban political ecology relates to urban epidemiology and public health. And this is, I think, an area, a natural area for urban political ecology to develop a distinctive perspective. If we think, for example, about the increasing significance of new and emerging diseases, Ebola being a very good example, that Ebola was regarded as essentially a disease that was restricted to quite isolated rural communities. And it's also a zoonotic disease in the sense that it has a reservoir within animals. But the recent outbreak of 2016 was quite distinctive in terms of the way that Ebola spread very rapidly through major metropolitan areas. So we could argue there's been a kind of an urbanization of this particular public health threat, which is something that I think urban political ecology could provide a distinctive perspective on in relation to, for example, the processes of environmental degradation, industrialized agriculture, deforestation, and so on, and how these processes relate to public health threats emerging in the urban arena. And just to give another simple illustration of this, a familiar scene to all of us traveling on public transport, when you think about it, it's quite incredible that a disease, an unknown disease associated with bats in remote landscapes has somehow had global implications for a whole combination of reasons. So this question of what I would refer to as zoonotic urbanization, the role of these and zoonotic transfer zones, and how this relates to urban political ecology, I think is a major challenge to consider. And then in terms perhaps of one or two other points to raise around urban political ecology, certainly in my own work, I'm very interested in cultural representations of nature and landscape. And when we move into the question of cultural representations, an important point is what kind of analytical tools do we need to make sense of cultural representations? And I think here again, I think urban political ecology could perhaps work harder to develop incisive analytical tools in relation to cinema, literature, and other cultural representations of urban space. So those are just a few pointers really in terms of potential areas for the further development of urban political ecology, which I'm very interested in and I explore in some of my recent writing. And then I want to move on to the fourth strand in terms of my kind of typology, as it were, of different approaches to urban nature, and that of the ecological pluriverse. And one of the contributory aspects here is an interest in welcoming nature or non-human others back into cities, back into urban space. And one starting point here, which has been very influential for me, is the classic essay by Jennifer Walsh, Zoopolis, published in 1996, which was partly inspired by the return of coyotes and other larger carnivores to metropolitan Los Angeles. And we could point to many other examples, foxes in London, leopards in Mumbai, for example, and other Indian cities, and even wolves returning to Western Europe. And there's a very interesting film actually called Wild, directed by Nicolette Krebitz from 2016, which I refer to in my book. And this film explores the evolving relationship between a young woman and a wolf that turns up in her local park in a post-industrial city in an eastern Germany. And it's an interesting exploration of the complexity of human-animal relationships. In reality, of course, it would be quite unusual to have a wolf as a pet, but nevertheless, it's a very interesting narrative structure. And returning for a moment to Jennifer Walsh's essay, Walsh argues that in her words, we need to renaturalize cities and invite the animals back in, and in the process, re-enchant the city. So this is the argument that she and others have presented. And I'm very interested in reflecting on what this means. If we welcome nature back into the city, what are the implications of this? What does it mean? A couple of other examples to share with you on this question of the ecological pluriverse is I was in Paris and I was struck by this very interesting poster campaign to protect rats. And it really made me reflect, actually. So the argument behind this interesting group, Zoopolis, based in Paris, is that rats are intelligent, sensitive creatures. They should be allowed to share urban space and not be the subject of efforts at eradication, that we should respect their presence as a kind of sharing our space. And they developed this notion of urban denizens. So not quite using the word citizen, but denizen in terms of non-human others who share urban space. And this I found interesting. Incidentally, they've also done campaigns against the use of animals in circuses and things like that. So a number of different areas that this group has campaigned on. And inevitably, when we think of the treatment of non-human others, it leads us towards reflection on food and food production. And something I reflected on in writing my book is the history of particularly abattoirs and meat production, and the kind of ethical questions that are raised by different food production practices that are raised by industrialized agriculture and also the mass transport of animals. And this question, of course, links back to that of zoonotic urbanization, because industrialized agriculture and practices of food production have very specific public health implications, which are very important to consider. Another aspect to the notion of the ecological pluriverse, beyond the ethical question, is interesting discussions about the work that non-human organisms do in cities, and very interesting debates about, for example, the working horse of the 19th century city, for example, and more recently, discussion about the work that plants do in relation to cities. So if we think about aspects of landscape design, interesting reflections on what plants are actually doing in terms of contributing to our aims in terms of aesthetics and landscape design, expanding, if you like, the concept of work to non-human others within the metropolitan arena. And I also wanted to show you this example from the French designer, Gilles Clément, who has been very influential on my own thinking, because Clément likes to use the spontaneous dynamics of nature as part of his landscape designs. And it's quite interesting now that a number of new parks have these areas which are set aside, sometimes with different mowing regimes, to enable wildflowers to flourish. And in terms of the landscape design aesthetic, I would draw your attention to the edge effect running through the middle of this image, which I think is very interesting, because in a way this indicates to visitors that it wasn't that people forgot to mow one side of the park, but there was an idea here. There was a, if you like, there was an intention between these different aspects of urban nature and their juxtaposition. So I think this is very interesting. And certainly in terms of architecture and design, there's now discussion about animal-aided design, and the idea that we design apartments already with nesting sites for birds or small cavities for bats to live in and things like that. That we're designing buildings for non-human others from the outset, rather than these buildings being discovered by chance or spontaneously. It forms part of design. But one of the tensions, perhaps, in relation to using nature or ecology as a focal point for design is the problem of what I would call generic ecologies, which we see sometimes in architecture. This is where you've probably seen these digital computer projections where there are just kind of trees just imported in terms of the software program and so on, that there isn't much attention on the specific species or ecological relations within these digitized ecological projections. And sometimes this can create real problems. So an example that I really thought about was that there was a housing project in Milan that won all kinds of architectural awards for its trees and other vegetation growing up the side of the building. So it was a kind of one of these vegetal walls, if you like, on a massive scale that we perhaps all seen in shopping centers and airports sometimes and things like that. So this notion of a kind of green building, which won all these architectural awards. Then in Chengdu in China, they more or less built the same structure, but there were big problems because this ecological surface was perfect for mosquitoes carrying dengue fever. And very quickly, people were scared to even buy the apartments. And it was a kind of ecological architectural disaster, effectively, because the ecological context of Milan compared with Chengdu had not been taken into consideration. And on this question of ecological specificities, I've been very impressed by the Bishan Park in Singapore, this remodeling of an urban river, where it's been done in an ecologically very sensitive way, so that there are natural predators of mosquitoes, such as fish and dragonflies present, so that the idea that the presence of urban water might present an epidemiological threat has been reflected on at key stages in terms of the design, which I think is very interesting in terms of this tension I'm suggesting between generic ecologies and then specific ecologies. And in terms of the ecological pluriverse, and maybe linking with observational paradigms, the notion that through knowledge of nature, and particularly specific species, we can build up a much more sophisticated understanding of the ecological dynamics urban space. And I just want to give you an example. There's a lot of interest at the moment in so-called sentinel species, trying to have a better knowledge of the migratory flyways for birds, particularly in South and East Asia, and the possibility of avian flu virus spreading to human populations. And in order to understand these dynamics better, the tracking of migratory pathways for birds has been very important, and understanding those particular zones of intersection, urban deltas, urban wetlands, for example, where there might be a proximity between industrialized agriculture, the keeping of chickens, for example, and the presence of thousands of wild birds which have traveled long distances. So really developing a much a clearer understanding of the complexity of these ecological dynamics and the different species which share our space. So to conclude then, and then I think we have a bit of time for questions and discussion. One of the questions for me is whether we can build a new kind of conceptual synthesis from urban political ecology and other approaches. And I'm especially interested, I mentioned at the start of my presentation, I have some reservations about this dominant systems-based approach. And I guess part of the question would be, can we develop something different that could have some kind of resonance, not just within universities and teaching programs, but maybe even for professional practice? And the question is, could we somehow link elements from urban political ecology with, as I mentioned, the observational paradigms, including citizen science and so on, and also this notion of the ecological pluriverse and a more sophisticated set of ethical relations with non-human others? Is there a possibility to bring together some of these different strands? And I guess the kind of, maybe just the final point to mention would be this tension between generic ecologies, the type of ecologies which feature quite often in resilience discourse and these systems-based paradigms, and a focus on specific socio-ecological assemblages, the complexities on the ground, if you like, in relation to ecologies of endangerment, you know, which species, which biotopes are important or under threat, and also in epidemiological terms, what are those specific types of ecological relations that present a potential threat to us and our health as well, having that much more specific level of knowledge about urban nature. So I'm going to stop sharing. I think I've done that.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you very much, Matthew. I believe we have learned a lot from you, from different point of view about the urban nature, and it's such an interesting topic. So now we are going to the Q&A session. So if there are any question, please to us. Okay, yes, please, Ajahn Ian.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Matthew, for a very interesting talk and a very nice review of the various strands of thought within urban nature dichotomies of types. I have a little bit of a different question, which I'd like to challenge you a little bit on. And that, because a lot of work is being done to sort of challenge the various dualisms that exist, human, non-human, culture, nature. But the one dualism which seems to be more persistent than any others, especially within geography, is the urban-rural. Because almost every example that you provide of, urban nature interactions, you could replace urban and rural, and you could find all kinds of examples as well. And in geography, and particularly within political ecology, we've long been interested in the connections between the urban and the rural. And when we silo into urban or silo into rural, are we not missing something important in terms of the relationships between urban spaces and rural spaces? There's a new article that's just come out in Dialogues in Human Geography, written by Jamie Gillen, Tim Bunnell, and Jonathan Rigg. And they're bringing back this challenge to the urban and the rural. And it just seems to me that the one thing that's missing from all this literature is the connections between the urban and the rural. I mean, they're implied at moments, but they're never explicitly discussed. And I'm just wondering if we need to, would it not be better just to get back to political ecology and realize that political ecology can be both urban and rural and not silo into urban and rural kinds of ways of thinking, which seem to limit possibilities in a way that so many other aspects, geographers are challenging these dualisms, and yet the urban rural seems to be like a 10 meter high fence that limits us. So I'm just wondering if you could comment on that.
Okay, thanks very much, Ian, for a really, really important question. Yes, I mean, I think that I mentioned, for example, the scale critique of urban political ecology, which is coming very much from this neo-Lefebvrean planetary urbanization perspective, where I think some of that literature has tended to suggest that the rural is no longer a useful category, with this emphasis on this complete urbanization and so on. That's not a view that I take, by the way. I mean, I think that the urban-rural dynamic remains materially important in terms of, for example, the relationship between the zoonotic transfer zones I mentioned, and then some of the impacts experienced within the metropolitan arena. I think it's also culturally and symbolically very present. I think it would be a mistake to say that the rural is not there. But in terms of the broader question, you raise a very interesting question about whether we need urban political ecology, whether political ecology already handles many of these conceptual aspects. And this is a question that Bruce Braun raised some years ago, actually. And in a recent essay, I tried to go back to Bruce Braun's original question and reflect on this. And I think that it is useful to hold on to some sense of an urban political ecology as a kind of complementary conceptual vantage point to political ecology. I don't see these bodies of work being in contradiction. I see it more as a question of a modified vantage point. And one of the reasons for that is that I think that the metropolitan arena, I know we have to be careful with these different conceptual terms, I think the metropolitan arena has some cultural, historical, and also geographical specificities which are useful and interesting for us. And also, I think in terms of the broader discourse of environmental politics, I think we have to recognize that there are metropolitan versus non-metropolitan political dynamics, which are significant in terms of environmental discourse. So I think that I think it's useful, I would argue, to retain some conceptualization of the urban, perhaps via urban political ecology, within our analysis.
Yeah, thank you very much. In my response to the article I just mentioned by Jamie Gillen, Bunnell, and Rigg, I suggested that it's probably because there is so much attached to the urban that we're probably not ready to jettison it entirely. But what I've suggested might be useful is to scale down our emphasis of the urban. So you're right, there are some specificities, but one could say that there are also specificities, within different rural areas as well. And I think the same things are occurring, and sometimes there are certain urban places that are maybe closer to other rural places than they are to other urban places. I think that there is a lot of different possibilities, and that maybe while there may be some specificities and things related to the urban that we want to maintain because they're useful analytically, that we should also be wary that these advantages don't come back to blind us to some of the connections between different types of spaces, and that the dualism may prevent us from seeing. And so I'm thinking for example, if you think about Bill Cronin's classical book, connecting Chicago with so many other places, right? If he had focused on an urban only kind of reckoning of that, he wouldn't have been able to write that book because it's so connected to other places. And so I guess what I'm arguing is that we may not be ready to jettison ourselves from the urban rural dualism right away, because there's a lot of knowledge that's been accumulated in relation to all this, but maybe we should be scaling down a little bit on our, in terms of being more open to these, how do we think about, for example, suburban spaces, peri-urban spaces, spaces that are, in between spaces. I mean, we know that every time we have a binary and a dualism, it limits us in certain ways. And where do we put those boundaries between these spaces? It's getting harder and harder, as I think your review very clearly makes clear. I mean, we have coyotes coming into urban spaces now, and these lines between the urban and the rural are becoming blurred increasingly. And I think the work that's been done by so many people is indicating that. So anyway, that's all I'm saying, is I think that it would be nice if everyone would be kind of more open to the connections between different spaces, rather than the siloing into this binary of urban rural, which I think may be useful in some ways, but I think it's also quite limiting in some ways.
I mean, if I could just make an extra remark, if that's helpful. I mean, I think that if we think about more restricted conceptions of space, and if you like, the city as a bounded object of research, in many ways, it's really the systems-based approach which does that routinely in terms of the way it presents or conceptualizes cities in various respects. But I think if you look at the history of the urban political ecology research, contributions, for example, from people like Eric Swingerdahl, that in the early work he did on Guayaquil in Ecuador, it wasn't just about Guayaquil. It was connected with shifting commodity markets, the post-colonial Ecuadorian state, and all different scales of interaction, if you like. So that, if you like, the rural processes were very present within his analysis, which was focused empirically at the metropolitan scale.
I agree totally with what you're saying there. And in fact, that's what political ecology has always been doing. Even before we attached the word urban to it, we were already doing that. And so I don't think, I mean, if you look back at Michael Watt's work, if you look at so many work, I mean, he worked in rural areas, urban. Anyway, I think you're right. The urban political ecologists are more sophisticated in that regard than the systems people that are probably more bounding the urban space more and in a more problematic way. So I would agree with you on that. Sorry, I don't want to monopolize. Let's get some other questions happening here.
Thank you very much. So, Kun Arya, please.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. So I have a question, and it's more related back to your suggestions of ecological flavors. So as a geographer, as a cultural human geographer who's been doing more on, like, let's say, ethnography work, and you are with the work related to more of a multi-species or plurals, how could we find a way? Do we need to be trained more into like a scientific or ecological understanding in order to approach this, or should like we work more with like physical geographers to tackle some of the political ecology problems, or totally different one? Because you have also mentioned that one of the key challenge with system-based approach is trying to put all the discipline within together in a unity, but it doesn't quite work. There's some tension in it as well. And I don't know if it's tension of just the basic kind of like quantitative and qualitative, or more of like the paradigms that's more like a tension. So yeah, my question would be more of like the approach. We are young scholars who are interested in doing multi-species or ecological pluribus, but with kind of like a position in political ecology, whether urban, rural, or both, or different scales. Mm-hmm. How do we train ourselves better to do this?
Okay, thank you so much. That's a really excellent question. I should, in a way, mention that although I'm a geographer, I have a kind of double life as an entomologist. I'm very interested in insects, and so I try to use my, if you like, specialist entomological knowledge to enrich the fieldwork that I do, including ethnographic fieldwork. So to give an illustration, I did some research in North London on a very rare fly discovered in a local park, and being involved in the fieldwork was part of the research process, and understanding the complex ecological relations, and then linking that with debates, for example, in critical legal studies, and trying to understand how scientific knowledge might be used to influence legal decisions or influence political discourse, things of that kind. So I guess what I would say in answer to your question is that I think it's important as individual researchers to build up some scientific knowledge. Of course, we can work with colleagues who can advise us on things, but I think it's also useful for yourself to build up a certain level of knowledge. So in relation to the urban botany work that I was doing, I was also trying to learn what these different plants are, to identify them. And also, if we're talking about ethnography and multisensory ethnographies, of course, it's great to realize that what you're hearing is a rose-ringed parakeet, and you make some notes and you know what that is. I think it's part of the kind of immediacy of multisensory ethnographic approaches to build up your knowledge. But I think on the question, you raise a very interesting point about interdisciplinary work. There's a school of thought that I didn't mention in my presentation that I've been thinking about. I've been trying to develop a notion of forensic ecologies influenced by forensic architecture at Goldsmiths College in London. and also bringing in forensic entomology and other angles. And it's very clear in relation to some of these research projects that we do need to link up with different sources of expertise. I think there is the potential to develop very interesting collaborative methodologies which are interdisciplinary and recognize the distinctive contributions that different disciplines can make. And one particular example that I've been reflecting on actually in relation to urban political ecology and tracing the flow of capital through urban space is the potential for forensic accountancy to play a role, like people who are very skilled in terms of understanding and tracking the flow of money and how it relates to the production of urban space as one possible example of a potential collaboration. Equally, in fields such as toxicology, I think it really does make sense to understand and, if necessary, work with experts who can actually provide those insights into different sources of pollution, for example, in urban environments. But I think that in all of these fields, I think if you build up some of your own knowledge, that really helps in terms of, so when you get to meet your toxicologist, if you already have some knowledge, that I think that helps enormously in terms of having some kind of meaningful dialogue and how that might form part of a research method. The other thing I'll quickly say in relation to your question is that I think that the field, I know it's a very complicated term, but if you like, being in the field or going into study sites, directly experiencing study sites is an important part of methodology, I would say, not just empirically, but conceptually. And I guess I'm always just a little bit cautious of very programmatic theoretical statements which are not connected to original or primary research. I think that if there's something distinctive about geography, perhaps, is the possibility to develop a very rich and multifaceted dialogue between, if you like, radical empiricism and innovative conceptual thinking. And just to return to my point about the very rare fly, I'd spent a long time studying this particular species and didn't see it. But then 6 months after I completed my project, I did actually manage to see it eventually. So if patience can pay off. So
Thank you very much.
Okay, I think is there any more question? Okay. So if there is, okay, then thank you very much again, Matthew, for being our guest speaker and giving such a wonderful research experience and the story from your book. And thank you very much all the audience for questions and for participating in our 8th virtual geography speaker series. So next time, the 9th virtual geography speaker series will be on the 22nd of July. And the speaker will be Professor Shin Hun Bang from the Department of Geography and Environment, LSE. He is also one of the editor of International Journal of Urban and Regional Research. So he's going to be our speaker, and he will speak about publishing a human geography paper. So I hope to see you all again next time. So for today, thank you and goodbye.
Thank you so much.
very much.
Thank you. Bye.